"Stop the test. Right now. The numbers are wrong." The words cut through the control room like a sudden alarm before anyone heard the sirens. Every conversation stopped. Every hand froze above the keyboards. On the largest screen inside the Oak Ridge Research Facility in Tennessee, a countdown continued moving towards 0. 3 minutes remained. The room was filled with some of the brightest scientific minds in the country, people who had spent decades studying energy systems, physics, and advanced technology. Yet the voice that had challenged them did not belong to a senior researcher or a government official. It belonged to a 15-year-old black boy standing near the back of the room, holding a worn notebook filled with handwritten calculations. His name was Daniel Carter. Dr. Richard Hayes slowly turned away from the main monitor and looked at him with disbelief. "Daniel, this is not a classroom," he said calmly. "This is a controlled research environment. You cannot walk in here and stop a project because of a few numbers on a page." Daniel looked toward the screen again. His eyes were not filled with anger. They were filled with concern. "I understand, Dr. Hayes." But the pressure pattern changed 30 seconds after the simulation started. "The system is building stress in a way your model did not predict." A few researchers exchanged uncomfortable looks. One engineer quietly lowered his glasses and checked the data. Another looked at the equations in Daniel's notebook. But the room had already decided who they believed. Dr. Hayes had a doctorate, 40 years of experience, and a team of experts behind him. Daniel was just a teenager from Huntsville, Alabama, a student who had arrived that morning hoping someone would listen. "You are very talented," Dr. Hayes said, choosing his words carefully. "But talent and experience are not the same thing." Daniel held his notebook tighter. "No, sir, they are not. But the numbers are still the numbers." For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the quiet hum of computers and the steady countdown on the wall. 2 minutes and 30 seconds. "Doctor," Hayes sighed and turned back toward his team. "Continue the preparation." Daniel watched as one of the technicians moved his warning report into a folder marked "Unverified." A small action, a simple decision. But to Daniel, it felt heavier than the entire room. Months of work, calculations, and careful analysis had been reduced to a label because of who he was and how old he looked. He stepped closer one last time. "Sir, I hope I'm wrong. I really do. But if I'm right, people need to know before it's too late." Dr. Hayes looked at him. For a brief second, he saw more than a student. He saw someone who genuinely cared about the people inside that building and the city beyond it. But pride and pressure moved faster than doubt. "Daniel, please leave the control area." The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a closed door. Daniel lowered his eyes, picked up his notebook, and walked toward the exit. Through the glass walls, the lights of Oak Ridge reflected across the polished floor. Outside, the evening sky over Tennessee was turning deep blue, and the city lights began appearing one by one in the distance. Daniel stopped near the doorway and looked back at the giant screen. The countdown continued. The same equations that everyone ignored were still there, waiting. And somewhere inside that room, hidden between lines of data and forgotten calculations, was the warning that could change everything. Daniel Carter had learned something important long before he ever stepped inside the Oak Ridge Research Facility. The world did not always ignore people because they were wrong. Sometimes it ignored them because of what they looked like, how old they were, or where they came from. In Huntsville, Alabama, Daniel was known as the quiet kid who always carried a notebook filled with equations. He was not the student who raised his hand first in every class. He was not the one looking for attention. Most days, he sat near the window in the back of the classroom, watching patterns that other people never noticed. Numbers, movements, changes in temperature, tiny details that seemed invisible to everyone else. His mother, Angela Carter, had always told him, "Daniel, your gift is not about being smarter than someone else. It is about using what you know to help someone." Angela worked as a nurse at Huntsville Hospital, and she spent most of her life caring for people who needed help. She came home tired after long shifts, but she always made time to ask Daniel one question. "Did you learn something today?" And Daniel always had an answer. Sometimes it was about physics. Sometimes it was about people. When Daniel was 12 years old, he met Noah Hayes, the son of Dr. Richard Hayes, during a community science program. Noah was struggling with a rare neurological condition that affected the way his body processed certain signals. Doctors were searching for better ways to understand his symptoms, but progress was slow. Daniel noticed something in the data from a public research report. He saw a mathematical pattern that others had overlooked. He spent weeks studying the information after school, creating a simple model that helped doctors organize the information differently. Daniel never expected praise. He never asked for recognition. He simply handed his notes to a local researcher and walked away. Months later, Noah's condition improved, and his family never knew that a 15-year-old boy had quietly contributed to the breakthrough. Daniel kept that part of his life private. He believed helping someone was more important than receiving credit. But inside the scientific world, where reputation and credentials carried enormous weight, Daniel was still just a teenager. His teachers saw his potential, but many adults outside his school saw only his age. One afternoon, Daniel's physics teacher, Mr. Thomas Reed, found him reviewing technical documents in the library. He looked at the pages and smiled. "You understand these formulas?" he asked. Daniel nodded. "Some of them. I am still trying to understand the parts I do not know." Mr. Reed looked impressed. "That answer is why you will go far. The smartest people are usually the ones who know there is always more to learn." That same week, Daniel discovered the Energy Research Project at Oak Ridge. The public information described it as one of the most advanced experimental programs in the region. To most people, it was just another major scientific project. To Daniel, it was a collection of patterns waiting to be understood. He studied the available information late into the night. The more he looked, the more something bothered him. There was a small inconsistency in the system calculations, a tiny change that most people would consider meaningless. But Daniel knew small changes could create large consequences. He wrote page after page of notes. He checked his calculations again and again. He did not want to be right. He wanted everyone to be safe. That was why he went to Oak Ridge. Not because he wanted recognition, not because he wanted to prove anyone wrong. He went because he believed knowledge had a responsibility attached to it. Standing outside the facility that morning, holding his notebook against his chest, Daniel looked at the massive building surrounded by security fences and research equipment. For a moment, he wondered if anyone would listen. Then he remembered his mother's words. "Your voice matters even when the room is not ready to hear it." Daniel took a deep breath and walked inside. He did not know that within hours, the same people who dismissed him would be forced to look at the information he carried. He did not know that the notebook in his hands contained the warning they had missed. But Daniel knew one thing. The truth did not become less true just because people refused to believe it. Inside the Oak Ridge research facility, everything moved with the precision of a machine. Scientists walked through bright corridors carrying tablets, engineers reviewed technical reports, and researchers monitored dozens of screens filled with information most people would never understand. To them, every number had a place, every calculation had been reviewed, and every decision had been approved by experts with years of experience. At the center of it all was Dr. Richard Hayes. For more than 3 decades, he had built a reputation as one of the most respected researchers in advanced energy systems. His name carried weight in scientific meetings across the country. When he entered a room, people listened. When he spoke about a project, others trusted his judgment. That confidence had helped him reach the top of his field, but it also created a blind spot he never expected. Dr. Hayes believed that experience was the foundation of good decisions. He believed knowledge came from years of study, professional achievements, and time spent inside laboratories. That belief made it difficult for him to accept that a 15-year-old student could notice something his entire team had missed. Earlier that morning, Dr. Hayes had been reviewing the final preparations with his team. "The system checks are complete," said one engineer. "All primary models are matching expectations." Dr. Hayes nodded while looking over the data. "Good. We proceed according to schedule." The room around him reflected confidence. Researchers moved quickly, focused on their assignments. Nobody expected a problem. Nobody expected a teenager to walk through the door carrying a notebook. When Daniel Carter arrived, he immediately noticed the difference between himself and everyone around him. The researchers wore professional badges. Their conversations were filled with technical language. Their confidence came from years of education and recognition. Daniel was wearing a simple blue jacket, carrying a backpack, and holding handwritten calculations that had been created at his small desk at home. He knew how he looked in that room. He knew what people saw before they even heard him speak. A kid, a student, someone who did not belong among experts. As Daniel approached the research team, one assistant looked confused. "Can I help you?" she asked. Daniel politely explained why he was there. "I have information about the current system calculations." I believe there may be a problem with the pressure model. The assistant looked toward the conference room. Are you part of the research team? Daniel shook his head. No, but I studied the available data. A few minutes later, Daniel was standing in front of Dr. Hayes and several senior researchers. The room became quiet as they listened, not because they believed him, but because they were surprised he had entered the conversation at all. Dr. Hayes looked at the notebook in Daniel's hands. You created this analysis yourself? Yes, sir. And you believe our entire team missed something? Daniel paused before answering. I believe everyone can miss something. That is why we checked the numbers. One researcher leaned back in his chair. Another exchanged a glance with a colleague. Daniel's words were respectful, but his confidence made the room uncomfortable. Dr. Hayes looked through the pages. He saw formulas, diagrams, and detailed observations. He also saw the name written at the top of the page. Daniel Carter, a student. Daniel, Dr. Hayes said, I appreciate your interest in science, but this project involves complex systems that require years of professional training. Daniel nodded. I understand that, sir. But the system does not know how old I am. It only responds to the data. The sentence stayed in the room for a moment. Some people looked away. Some continued reading the information. But nobody openly challenged him. Dr. Hayes returned the notebook. We will review your concerns. Daniel understood what that meant. It was a polite way of saying the conversation was over. He walked away quietly, passing scientists who never looked up from their screens. But one person did notice. Dr. Emily Brooks, a physicist who had been observing the exchange from across the room, looked back at Daniel's calculations after he left. Something about his work bothered her. Not because it was wrong, because it was too carefully done to ignore. She picked up the notebook pages Daniel had left behind and studied the patterns again. For the first time that day, someone inside the facility was not looking at the person who created the warning. They were looking at the warning itself. Dr. Emily Brooks remained standing near the conference table long after Daniel Carter had left the room. Around her, the research team continued preparing for the scheduled test, moving from one task to another as if nothing unusual had happened. But Emily could not stop thinking about the pages in her hands. She had reviewed thousands of scientific reports during her career. She had seen mistakes, incomplete models, and ambitious ideas that never became reality. But Daniel's work was different. It was not a guess. It was not a student experiment created for a classroom project. The calculations showed a clear understanding of how the system behaved under changing conditions. Emily slowly turned another page and noticed something that made her pause. Daniel had not only identified a possible issue, he had explained why it happened. How did a 15-year-old see this? She whispered. Before she could continue reading, Dr. Richard Hayes entered the room. He noticed the papers in her hand. Emily, are you reviewing the students' notes? She looked up. Yes, I think we should take another look. Dr. Hayes placed a folder on the table. We already reviewed his concerns. Emily shook her head. No, we reviewed his background. We reviewed his age. We reviewed whether he belonged in this room. I am talking about the calculations. The room became quiet. A few researchers looked toward them but quickly returned to their screens. Dr. Hayes remained calm. Emily, you know better than anyone how much work goes into a project like this. We cannot change everything because someone outside the team raises a concern. Emily looked down at the pages again. What if he is not someone outside the team? What if he is someone who found something we missed? The question stayed between them. Dr. Hayes did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the main display and reviewed the system information. The numbers appeared normal at first glance. Every measurement was within the expected range. That was exactly why nobody had questioned it. The problem was hidden in the pattern, not the individual numbers. Daniel had noticed the relationship between them. A small shift, a slight change, something most people would have considered insignificant. Emily moved closer to the screen. Run the pressure comparison from the last simulation, she told one of the engineers. The engineer hesitated. The comparison was already completed. Run it again, Emily said. Please. The engineer followed the instruction. Seconds later, a new set of information appeared. The room became quieter with every passing moment. Dr. Hayes stepped closer. That cannot be right. Emily pointed toward the screen. Look at the curve. It is not following the original prediction. Another researcher adjusted the data settings and checked the results. His expression changed slightly. The difference is small. Emily nodded. Small changes are exactly what create larger problems when systems become complex. Across the facility, Daniel was sitting alone in a small waiting area near the entrance. His notebook rested on his knees. He could hear distant conversations through the glass doors, but he could not hear what anyone was saying. He had no idea if they were reviewing his work or forgetting about it. For Daniel, the hardest part was not being questioned. He expected that. The hardest part was watching people decide his value before understanding his ideas. He looked at the handwritten pages inside his notebook. Every calculation represented hours of study. Every note represented a question he refused to ignore. A security employee walked past and offered him a bottle of water. "Long day?" the man asked. Daniel gave a small smile. "A little. You waiting for someone?" Daniel looked toward the research building. "I'm waiting to see if they listen." Inside the facility, Dr. Hayes continued reviewing the data. His confidence had not disappeared, but something had changed. For the first time, he was no longer looking at Daniel's age or his lack of credentials. He was looking at the evidence. Emily placed the notebook on the table. "Richard, we need to pause and examine this carefully." Dr. Hayes looked at the countdown schedule on the wall. The test was approaching. The decision window was becoming smaller. He picked up Daniel's calculations again and read the final sentence written at the bottom of the page. "The safest assumption is the one that protects people, even when the probability seems low." For a moment, the room was completely silent, because hidden inside those simple words was something the experts had forgotten. Science was not only about being correct, it was about being responsible. And somewhere outside that room, a teenager who nobody expected to hear had already done the most important thing a scientist could do. He had paid attention. The room that had once been filled with confidence was now filled with uncertainty. Inside the Oak Ridge Control Center, the countdown continued moving forward while researchers stared at the changing data on their screen. Nobody spoke loudly anymore. The atmosphere had shifted. The same people who had dismissed Daniel Carter's warning were now studying the exact calculations they had ignored. Dr. Richard Hayes stood near the main display, his eyes fixed on the pressure curve that continued to move away from the expected pattern. For the first time that day, he was not thinking about Daniel's age. He was not thinking about his lack of credentials. He was looking only at the information. "Run the model again," Dr. Hayes said. The engineer beside him quickly entered the command. A few seconds passed. Then the results appeared. The same pattern. The same irregular change Daniel had identified hours earlier. Emily Brooks watched Dr. Hayes carefully. She could see the realization forming on his face, but she could also see the weight of admitting it. Leaders were often expected to have answers. They were rarely prepared for the moment when they had to admit someone else saw what they missed. "Richard," Emily said quietly, "we need to delay the test." The room became still. One senior researcher looked surprised. "Delay the entire schedule because of a student's prediction?" he asked. Emily turned toward him. "Not because of who made the prediction, because of what the data shows." The sentence changed the room. It was no longer about Daniel Carter. It was about the evidence in front of them. "Doctor," Hayes looked at the clock. The schedule had been carefully planned for months. Hundreds of decisions had led them to this moment. Changing course would mean accepting that their process had failed to catch something important, but continuing would mean ignoring information that could not be explained away. He picked up Daniel's notebook again. The pages were simple. No expensive equipment. No official research title, just careful observations written in a teenager's handwriting. Near the bottom of one page, Dr. Hayes noticed a note Daniel had written beside a calculation. "When a system becomes complex, small changes deserve attention." He read the sentence twice. It reminded him of something his own mentor had told him decades earlier. The most dangerous mistakes were not always the obvious ones. Sometimes they were the small details everyone assumed were too insignificant to matter. Meanwhile, Daniel remained in the waiting area outside the facility. He watched employees walk past carrying folders and equipment. Some looked curious. Some looked like they had already forgotten him. He did not know what was happening inside. He only knew that he had done what he believed was right. A young researcher named Marcus Lee walked toward him holding a tablet. "Daniel?" he asked. Daniel stood up. "Yes?" Marcus looked at the notebook in Daniel's hands. "Can I ask you something? How did you find the pattern?" Daniel opened the notebook. "I was comparing the old simulation results with the new model. Everyone was looking at whether the numbers matched. I was looking at how quickly they changed." Marcus nodded slowly. "That is a different way of seeing it." Daniel gave a small smile. "Sometimes the things people ignore are the things worth checking." Inside the control room, Dr. Hayes made his decision. "Pause the preparation," he said. Several people looked up. The order was clear. The test would not continue until the data was fully reviewed. The room immediately became active. Engineers began checking systems. Researchers compared calculations. New questions replaced old assumptions. Dr. Hayes walked toward the entrance of the control area, where he saw Daniel standing with Marcus. For a moment, he stopped. The young boy who had been asked to leave was now the person everyone needed to understand. Daniel, Dr. Hayes said. Daniel turned around. Yes, sir? Doctor. Hayes looked at the notebook in his hands. I need you to show us exactly how you reached your conclusion. Daniel studied his expression carefully. Hours earlier, those same words would have sounded impossible. Now, they carried something different. Not agreement yet. Not an apology, but something close. Respect. Daniel walked back toward the room. The same doors that had closed in front of him earlier opened again. And this time, he was not entering as a visitor. He was entering as the person whose voice had forced everyone inside to look closer. For the first time since Daniel Carter entered the Oak Ridge Research Facility, the room was no longer focused on proving him wrong. It was focused on understanding why he was right. Daniel stood beside the main display with his notebook open, surrounded by scientists who had spent years studying the same systems he had analyzed from a small desk at home. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The young boy in the simple blue jacket was now explaining complex patterns to people who once believed he did not belong in the room. Start from the beginning, Dr. Richard Hayes said. His voice was calmer than before. Daniel nodded and stepped closer to the screen. The original model was based on stable conditions, but the system does not stay perfectly stable. Small changes happen continuously. I tracked the rate of those changes instead of only comparing the final numbers. He pointed to a section of the data. This is where the pattern begins to separate. Several researchers moved closer. The same information they had looked at earlier now appeared different because someone had asked a different question. Doctor. Emily Brooks watched Daniel carefully. She noticed something beyond his intelligence. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was not trying to make the experts feel embarrassed. He was simply trying to explain what he saw. How long did it take you to find this? One researcher asked. Daniel looked down at his notebook. A few weeks. The researcher looked surprised. You studied this after school? Daniel nodded. Yes, I was curious. Doctor. Hayes looked at the calculations again. And you were confident enough to come here alone? Daniel paused. I was not confident they would believe me. I was confident that the information needed to be checked. The answer stayed with everyone in the room. It was not the response of someone looking for attention. It was the response of someone who understood responsibility. Outside the control area, the evening light moved across the windows of the facility. The city of Oak Ridge continued its normal rhythm, unaware of how close everyone had come to overlooking a warning. Inside, the researchers continued reviewing Daniel's work line by line. The tension in the room slowly changed. Earlier, Daniel had been defending his right to speak. Now, everyone was listening. But for Daniel, the moment was not about winning. His thoughts went back to the reason he came there in the first place. He remembered his mother sitting at the kitchen table in their Huntsville home, looking through his notes while preparing for another shift at the hospital. Daniel, Angela had told him, knowledge is a gift, but it becomes meaningful when you use it to protect others. Those words had followed him into the facility. They were why he never raised his voice when people dismissed him. They were why he never walked away when the easier choice would have been silence. Dr. Hayes noticed the way Daniel looked at the data. There was no pride in his expression. No desire to prove anyone had failed. Only concern. You helped someone before, Dr. Hayes said quietly. Daniel looked confused. What do you mean, Doctor? Hayes glanced at Emily. Emily mentioned that you had worked on medical research information before. Something involving my son. Daniel became quiet. For a moment, the noise of the control room seemed to disappear. Noah is doing better now, Daniel said softly. Doctor, Hayes looked at him. You knew about him? Daniel nodded. I saw some public information and found a pattern that might help. I shared it with a researcher. Why did you never tell us? Daniel looked at the floor for a moment. Because Noah needed help. He did not need my name. The room became completely silent. The researchers had spent the entire day measuring Daniel's intelligence, but now they were seeing something else, his character. Dr. Emily Brooks looked at Dr. Hayes and quietly said, That is the part we missed. Dr. Hayes did not respond immediately. He looked at the teenager standing in front of him and realized that the most important thing Daniel brought into the room was not just a calculation. It was a sense of responsibility that many people spent a lifetime trying to develop. The facility remained quiet as the final reviews continued. The screen still showed complex data. The equipment still hummed softly. But something had changed. A door that had once been closed by assumptions had opened because one person refused to stop caring. Daniel closed his notebook and waited. He still did not know what would happen next. But for the first time that day, he knew someone had truly heard him. The final review inside the Oak Ridge Control Center continued as the evening hours passed. But the atmosphere had completely changed. The same room that once felt distant and unwelcoming now felt focused and determined. Scientists who had spent years trusting their own models were now carefully examining the work of a 15-year-old boy who had simply paid attention to what others overlooked. Dr. Richard Hayes stood quietly near the main screen, watching the latest analysis appear. Every new calculation confirmed the same conclusion. Daniel Carter had identified the problem before anyone else. Dr. Emily Brooks looked at the updated results and spoke softly. "The pattern is consistent. His prediction was not a coincidence." Nobody answered immediately. The words carried a different meaning now. They were not just confirming a scientific observation. They were confirming that a young black student had been ignored because people assumed they already knew who deserved to be heard. Dr. Hayes walked toward Daniel's notebook, still open on the table. He turned each page slowly, noticing the details he had overlooked earlier. Daniel had documented every step. Every calculation had been checked. Every assumption had been explained. There was no shortcut. There was no guess. There was discipline. "How did we miss this?" Dr. Hayes asked quietly. Daniel looked at him but did not answer right away. He understood that the question was not only about the data, it was about everything that happened before the data was even considered. "Sometimes people look at where information comes from before they look at whether it is true," Daniel finally said. The room became silent. Nobody argued with him because everyone understood the meaning behind those words. Dr. Hayes lowered his eyes for a moment. He thought about the first time Daniel entered the room. He remembered seeing a teenager instead of a scientist. He remembered hearing an unfamiliar voice instead of listening to the message. The realization was uncomfortable because it was not about one mistake. It was about a habit of judging too quickly. Meanwhile, the technical team completed another round of checks. The results showed that Daniel's calculations had revealed an important issue in the original assumptions. The project could move forward only after adjustments were made. The decision that had seemed impossible hours earlier was now obvious. The warning had mattered. Dr. Hayes turned toward the team. "Document everything Daniel provided, every calculation, every observation." One researcher nodded. "Understood." Then Dr. Hayes looked at Daniel. "I owe you an apology." Daniel remained quiet. He had imagined this moment many times, but not because he wanted an apology. He wanted people to be safe. "I should have listened earlier," Dr. Hayes continued. "I focused on your age before I focused on your work." Daniel looked down at the notebook in his hands. "I just wanted someone to check the numbers." Dr. Hayes nodded slowly. "And you were right to ask." The words were simple, but they meant something different coming from a person who had once asked him to leave. Dr. Emily Brooks watched the conversation quietly. She knew the scientific discovery was important, but the lesson inside the room was even bigger. A person's value could not be measured by a title, a position, or the assumptions others carried. Outside the facility, the lights of Oak Ridge reflected across the streets of Tennessee. People continued driving home, families prepared dinner, and the city moved through another ordinary evening. They did not know that a teenager's careful observation had changed the direction of an important project. They did not know that someone who had been treated like an outsider had helped protect them. Inside the building, Daniel packed his notebook into his backpack. The pages were still the same. His handwriting was still the same. He was still the same 15-year-old from Huntsville who loved science and wanted to help people. But the way others saw him had changed. Dr. Hayes walked with him toward the exit. "Daniel, there is something I hope you remember." Daniel looked up. "What is that?" "Doctor." Hayes paused. "Never stop asking questions, even when people tell you that you are not supposed to have answers." Daniel gave a small smile. For the first time that day, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. He stepped outside into the cool Tennessee air, carrying the same notebook that had been ignored hours earlier. But now, those pages were no longer just notes from a student. They were proof that truth could come from anywhere, and sometimes the most important voice in the room belonged to the person everyone almost overlooked. The morning after the review at Oak Ridge felt different. The same hallways that had once seemed cold and distant now carried a quiet sense of change. Researchers walked past the glass walls with a new awareness. They were no longer talking about whether Daniel Carter belonged in the room. They were talking about what they could learn from him. In the small conference room near the research center entrance, Daniel sat across from Dr. Richard Hayes and Dr. Emily Brooks. His backpack rested beside his chair, the same notebook still inside. The notebook that had been ignored was now carefully placed on the table like something valuable. Doctor, Hayes looked at Daniel for a moment before speaking. I have spent most of my career believing that experience is what separates good decisions from bad ones, he said. And experience does matter. But yesterday reminded me that experience should never become a reason to stop listening. Daniel listened quietly. He had spent years learning that respect was not always given immediately. Sometimes it had to be earned. Sometimes it had to survive being overlooked. Doctor, Hayes continued, I want you to know that your work will be included in the official review. Your analysis helped us see something important. Daniel looked surprised. My name? He asked. Dr. Hayes nodded. Your name. For Daniel, those two words carried more meaning than anyone in the room realized. He had never chased recognition. He had never walked into Oak Ridge hoping to become famous. He simply wanted someone to check the information. But being recognized meant something deeper. It meant the person behind the idea mattered too. Later that afternoon, Dr. Emily Brooks invited Daniel to walk through the research area. This time, people greeted him differently. A few researchers who had avoided eye contact the day before now stopped to ask questions. How did you become interested in this field? One engineer asked. Daniel smiled. My mother says curiosity is a habit. Once you start asking why, you never really stop. Another researcher looked at the notebook in his hand. Do you always write everything down? Daniel nodded. Almost everything. Ideas disappear if you do not capture them. The conversations were simple, but they represented a major change. Daniel was no longer someone standing outside the circle of experts. He was someone being invited into the conversation. Before leaving the facility, Daniel received a message from his mother. It was short, as Angela Carter usually was after a long shift at the hospital. Are you okay? Daniel smiled and replied, Yes. They listened. A few seconds later, another message appeared. I knew they would eventually. Daniel looked at those words for a long moment. His mother had always believed in him before anyone else did. She never told him that success would be easy. She only reminded him that doing the right thing mattered more than being accepted. That evening, Daniel returned home to Huntsville. The familiar sound of his neighborhood surrounded him. The same streets, the same small house, the same desk where he had spent countless hours studying. Nothing looked different, yet everything felt different. He placed his notebook on the table and opened it again. The pages were filled with formulas, questions, and observations. To anyone else, they were just handwritten notes. To Daniel, they represented something more. They represented every moment he chose curiosity over doubt. Every moment he continued learning, even when nobody was watching. A few days later, Dr. Hayes visited Huntsville to speak at a local science event. When he stepped onto the stage, he did not begin by talking about the project. He began by talking about a lesson he had learned. The future of science depends on our ability to recognize ideas wherever they come from, he told the audience. A person's background should never decide whether their voice matters. Daniel sat quietly among the students listening. He did not expect to become an example. He did not expect people to remember his name. But as the applause filled the room, he understood something important. The greatest discoveries were not always created by the people with the biggest offices or the most impressive titles. Sometimes they came from someone sitting alone at a small desk, asking a question nobody else thought to ask. And sometimes, saving the future began with simply having the courage to speak. Years passed, but Daniel Carter never forgot the day when a quiet warning written in a simple notebook changed the way people listened. The memory stayed with him, not because of the attention that followed, but because of the lesson hidden inside it. A voice could be small and still carry something important. A person could be young and still have something valuable to contribute. Daniel continued his journey in science, but he never allowed recognition to become the reason he learned. He remained the same person who studied late at night, who asked questions others ignored, and who believed knowledge was only meaningful when it helped someone else. In Huntsville, Alabama, Daniel became known among students as someone who always looked deeper. When classmates struggled with difficult problems, he did not simply give them answers. He sat with them and helped them understand. His teachers noticed that his greatest strength was not only his ability to solve complex equations, it was his patience. One afternoon, a younger student approached him after a science club meeting. "How do you know when an idea is worth following?" the student asked. Daniel smiled and looked at the notebook in his hands. "You do not always know at first. You just keep asking questions until the answer becomes clear." That mindset followed Daniel as he continued his education. He studied advanced physics, worked with researchers, and continued exploring ways technology could improve people's lives. But no matter how many achievements came later, he remembered the importance of that moment at Oak Ridge. The moment when someone finally decided to look at the information instead of the person who brought it. Dr. Richard Hayes also carried that lesson with him. His career continued, but his approach changed. In every research meeting, he asked one question before anything else. "What are we missing?" His colleagues noticed the difference. He no longer believed that the most experienced person in the room always had the best answer. He believed the best answer could come from anyone willing to search for the truth. Years later, Dr. Hayes wrote a letter to Daniel. In it, he shared something he had never forgotten. The most important discovery that day was not a scientific one. It was realizing that knowledge has no age, no appearance, and no position. It only has value when people are willing to listen. Daniel kept that letter, not because it praised him, but because it represented change. It represented a moment when a closed door opened, a moment when assumptions gave way to understanding. One evening, Daniel returned to the same small desk where he had once written his first calculations. The room was quiet. The light from the window touched the pages of his old notebook. The handwriting was younger. The questions were simpler, but the purpose behind them was still the same. He looked through the pages and remembered his mother's words. "Your gift is not about being better than others. It is about helping others see what they cannot see yet." Daniel closed the notebook and placed it carefully on the shelf. Outside, the city of Huntsville continued moving. People drove home from work. Families gathered around dinner tables. Students opened books and dreamed about the future. Somewhere among them was another young person with an idea that had not yet been heard. And maybe that person would need the same reminder Daniel once needed. That being overlooked does not mean being without value. That silence does not mean weakness. That a thoughtful question can be more powerful than a loud voice. Daniel Carter did not change the world because people finally decided to notice him. He changed it because he never stopped caring when nobody was watching. And in the quiet moments after everything was finished, the greatest proof of his journey was not a title, an award, or a name on a wall. It was the simple truth that one person chose to speak, and many lives became safer because someone finally listened.